Hey, what's up? Nico DPS here once again, and today I'm going to give you a quick overview of my thoughts and opinions on some of the more notable changes brought up in the patch 3.19 balance manifesto. I'm not going to go over it in full and do a full in-depth review of it. I'm just going to touch on the notable changes here. That way I can keep it short and sweet. I'd assume most of you watching this video have already read the entire manifesto yourselves, or at least heard another content creator give their insights and opinions on the manifesto. So without further ado, let's hop right in. First things first, we got suppression changes. Now, I'm not necessarily surprised by the suppression change. It was fairly easy, all things considered, at least at a higher end level, to suppress cap, really regardless of where you started on the tree, and I don't think that was really ever intended by them, at least based on these changes. It wasn't intended by them to be that way in the first place. So they decided to tone things down on your gear quite a bit, but in return, they're buffing the suppress nodes on the actual tree, which a little bit of give and take there. I can't complain too much. It does hurt quite a bit if you aren't something like a duelist, a ranger, or a shadow. Because you have to invest significantly more points into the tree to even get over the suppression nodes, but that's understandable, right? If you think of something like block takes a pretty decent amount of investment to get up to block cap, right? Suppression was far easier to get capped on suppression, and it provided a pretty similar level of defensive layer to your character. So overall, understandable change. It does suck, it hurts, but we can definitely live with it. Next up on the chopping block is Defiance banner. This is another one I think was a fairly reasonable change, all things considered. Most of the community is known, as you can tell just by the usage statistics, that Defiance banner is extremely powerful, especially given the amount of mana it reserves. So essentially what they did was they cut the armor and evasion scaling in half, but to compensate, they actually bumped up the reduced critical strike chance to your enemies. So all things considered, fairly reasonable change, still an extremely powerful skill. Next up, we got the Grasping Mail modifier and the Gravicius Veiled modifier. So quickly touching on the Grasping Mail modifier, I definitely think most of the power from this 100% increased global defenses was enabled via recombinators and transferring it onto a more powerful base, something like a Vol Regalia. So I'm a little surprised by this change, and I don't necessarily agree with it, given that global defenses is basically going to be exclusively back on the Grasping Mail, but apparently GGG disagrees, and it's going to be cut in half. Definitely sad there. Definitely sad. The Gravicious Veil modifier, on the other hand, I think is actually pretty interesting. So when I first read this, I was actually pretty disappointed, right? I really liked the additional defensive layer you could gain on your character via crafting or unveiling max life as ES and then getting Ghost Dance, and it added this really cool extra defensive layer that wasn't too powerful, but it just it was a little bit of icing on the cake, right? Just that little bit of extra defensive layer that you could feel a lot more durable with your character. And when I first read this, I was pretty disappointed. But as I thought about it further, a build like, say, Tornado Shot, which I ran recently, a lot of squishier builds, usually you're going to be more squishy with fizz damage mitigation than you are with elemental damage mitigation. And this craft is actually going to help significantly with that. So I think for a lot of builds, this is a net positive, and for some others, it's about a net zero. So overall, a change that I can be on board with for sure, and I'm looking forward to messing around with it in next league. Next up is the Fortify buffs. I definitely agree with the Fortify buffs here. I definitely think that it was a little bit lackluster to use given how long it would take for you to actually build up to 20 stacks for some builds. I think it was a little bit too much, and apparently GGG agrees with that, and they decided to allow basically twice the amount of fortification stack generation as before, so and increased its duration. So overall, a great defensive buff for the game, and I think it's going to make melee, at least what melee builds are left, or it's going to make them feel a little better when they decide to go the fortification route. So overall, great change. Okay, we're very briefly going to touch on the massive minion changes. Now, I personally never really play minion builds. They're not my style, so I usually opt out. However, the changes were so massive, I felt obligated to at least touch on them and bring them up very briefly. What I'd like to do is point you towards Gazzy TV. The guy is a minion wizard. He understands everything the game has to offer in regards to minions for the most part. So I'm going to point you towards him. That way you can get an opinion from somebody who actually knows what the hell they're talking about when it comes to minions. All right, next up, pretty surprisingly, is the lack of nerfs to traps overall. They were definitely targeting seismic trap, obviously, with these changes, but I really don't think it's going to be enough, all things considered. They toned down the skill effect duration from advanced traps, and the hasty reconstructive notable passive skill no longer grants 30% cooldown recovery rate. I don't think this is enough to tone down Seismic whatsoever. I still think it's going to be one of the best builds, if not the single best build in the game, which is a little surprising. You figured after Seismic being on top for so long, especially after this recent gauntlet, that they would kind of try and hit it a little harder, but apparently not. I guess we'll have to wait for the official patch note to see if they tone down the numbers of Seismic a little bit. But as of right now, Seismic is basically still going to be on top, in my opinion. So this next change I definitely am extremely disappointed with. We're going to go over the Blessing skills nerfs and their interaction with life tap. I don't agree with this change whatsoever. I don't understand why they did it. I think it was a very cool option that you could integrate into your build for at least a 3 link, and it costs a ton of health usually when you start using life tap with Divine Blessing and one of the auras. So you had to give up a 3 link at least, if not a 4 link, depending on what build you were trying to run, as well as a significant chunk of your life for a brief period of time, basically allowing Risk to die in order to get a pretty powerful buff. It added an extra button to your build, which sometimes I can kind of agree with. Sometimes it does get boring just literally only pressing one button, but apparently GGG disagrees and basically gutted life tap and blessing skills altogether. And now I don't see any way, especially with the mana reservation nerfs down below. I basically think they just nuked blessing skills altogether. For very few builds are going to use blessing skills now, I think, because the mana cost is just too high, and the mana reservation requirements for auras to actually allow your build to do higher end content is too high. So now blessing skills are basically just dead in the water. They're going to be used by very few builds, at least before with the life tap interaction. They were used by some builds, not even all builds, and it added a decent chunk of power and an extra button you could press for some extra damage for a short period of time. I really can't wrap my head around what GGG was thinking with this. This is one of the things I think they were pretty disconnected. That proves they're pretty disconnected with their player base, in my opinion. This just doesn't really make any sense, and I don't think it was warranted whatsoever. So this is one of the ones that really struck a nerve with me. I don't support this at all, and I think it's a terrible change for the game. Okay, now let's touch on, to me, what is to me the by far the most disappointing part of the balance manifesto, and that's the routine balance pass. This is such a joke, right? This is such a joke. You have the entire community screaming for changes to skills that everybody wants to use to make them viable. They don't have to be the most powerful. Just bring them up to where they're usable and fun to play, right? And they just refuse to do so. Like, why are we wasting time on giving Cleave +2 radius at level 20? That does absolutely nothing. Like, Decoy Totem. Nobody uses Decoy Totem. Why are we wasting time with that? Rejuve Totem. Nobody's going to use Rejuve Totem. Nobody's going to give up a totem slot and spend time casting Rejuve Totem. It's such a joke. Like, I feel like it's such a slap in the face to the player base. They're like, here's our routine balance pass, guys. Here's these buffs, right? And it's just these 2% buffs to skills that are either completely useless and worthless and nobody is going to use regardless of how powerful they were, or it's a buff that's like 2% and everything's 80% worse than the top skills and the most viable skills in the game, so they're still unusable. It's just like, what is their aversion to buffing skills, maybe possibly risking a little too much? So for a league, a build is overpowered, everybody has a bunch of fun, they tone it down a little bit, and we move on, and they keep the meta nice and fresh, right? Because if you buff something too much for a league, it has just as much of a meta shakeup as nerfing the most powerful thing into the dirt, right? You're still changing what skills people are playing. You're still giving people a different option and a different ability to check out and enjoy at the highest level of play, but they just refuse to do so because they want to take so much power away from the players. They won't think twice about just taking a sledgehammer to skills and items in the game and just basically nuking them from orbit and making sure they're never used again. But when it comes with buffs, they're going to give these little itty bitty incremental changes that basically do nothing. And I think that this is just another point that proves the disconnect that GGG has with their player base. And I think it's a little bit of arrogance, to be honest. I really do think it's arrogant, the amount of power that they want to take away from the players and the just minuscule amount of power that they give back to underutilized skills. Like, why are we not buffing melee skills or something like that, right? Melee players especially have been screaming for the longest time, just please give us some more viable option. There's really nothing good for melee to play. You've taken everything away and given nothing back. All that's really left is Lightning Strike when it comes to powerful melee skills. There's very few extremely powerful melee skills without significant investment or significant downsides to play other ones, right? And it's just extremely disappointing, man. I'm probably beating a dead horse. I probably repeated myself 10 times by now. I don't even know. I'm basically going on a rant here, but this is just disappointing. I think that's just the most concise way I can put it. Disappointing, and I really am worried about the state of the game in the future when it comes to this, because they just refuse to buff underutilized skills and shake up the meta a little bit by buffing some things, actually, rather than just nuking things and removing power, so much power from the players every league that they just don't want to play anymore. Because at the end of the day, if you take too much power away, you're going to kill this game, and nobody's going to have any fun anymore anyways. Just disappointing, man. Okay, moving on. Now we got some Ascendency balance changes. Now, first line up here is actually pretty exciting. They're going to be making some changes to Trickster, and they're going to reveal it in the patch notes, as far as I can tell. And I'm really excited to see what they've done to try and increase its viability and its play rate. I used to love Trickster back in the day. It had a lot of flavor to it. It was a lot of fun, and they kind of just nuked all of it per usual. So I'm curious to see what kind of changes they're making to bring Trickster back into viability. Next up, we got the Juggernaut Unbreakable skill. They're making some changes. They're basically breaking it up and splitting it into 2 notables. So I've heard varying opinions on this from basically both ends of the spectrum. I've heard that they just took 1 notable, split it into 2, and made them both worse. And I've also seen like, hey, this is actually a pretty significant buff for a lot of builds. So take this one as you will. I'm not going to pretend to know too much. I don't play a lot of Juggernaut myself. I played some accuracy stackers in the past, but it was long enough ago. I basically lost most of my Juggernaut knowledge. So take that as you will. Overall, I guess if the community is a bit divided on it, it's probably fairly reasonable the way they've changed it. In terms of if it's split both ways, that means it's usually somewhere in the middle in terms of how it actually works out, right? So take that one as you will. Next up, we got the Chieftain change. Essentially, they're making slams do 100% more damage instead of 50 if you take Tahoa's Chosen. I guess that's how you pronounce it. I hope. I tried my best. I guess if you play Chieftain Slam builds, that's awesome for you, but I don't think a lot of people do. And I think Slam builds are so unviable right now, and Chieftain's not very powerful at all. I don't think it's really going to shake up the meta in any way, but you never know. 50% more damage buff is actually pretty significant, and hey, maybe it changes it up a little bit and makes the Slam build viable. We'll see. Moving on to the Pathfinder changes. So originally when I first read this, the first line here where they're changing Master Alchemist to now give 20% magic utility flask effect, I thought, dude, that is awesome. Master Alchemist overall was pretty weak before, and this actually gives people a reason to go take it. But then you read the next line, and you see that Nature's Boon no longer grants 6% reduced elemental damage taken. Like, why? Nature's Boon was not too powerful. It is a travel node on the way to Master's Alchemist, so you need to at least have it make it somewhat viable, so it makes it worth traveling to Master's Alchemist. And they pretty much just made that a no. They pretty much said, hey, well, if you want to travel to Master's Alchemist, you're going to have to take this absolutely useless notable for 20% increased magic utility flask effect. That's it. Like, it's great. Magic utility flask effect is great, but at the cost of 4 ascendancy points, not too much, because Nature's Boon is now completely worthless. So I really don't understand why they chose to do this. Them changing this to 20% increased effect did not add too much power whatsoever. Like, Pathfinder was not overpowered in any way, and then they just decided to take reduced elemental damage taken away. So completely ridiculous in my opinion, and unwarranted in every single way. Very disappointing. All right, next we got a pretty big one. Crystallized Omniscience took a pretty massive hit. So instead of getting 1% elemental penetration per 10 and 1% all res per 10, now it's per 15 Omniscience. Now I'll quickly touch on just a little tip for you guys. You can actually make these adjustments in POB really easily. So if you go over to your items in your POB, and then you go over here to Crystallized Omniscience, you double click it, hit edit, you can change this per 10 Omniscience to per 15. As you can see, I've already done. You hit save, and then I'll add it to your build with the updated Omniscience power levels. And it is actually, you really have to go all in with these changes. You really have to go all in with Omniscience, and you actually have to think about where you have to sacrifice stats to actually get resistances, because at this point with the changes, you're going to have to be so deep into Omniscience and trying to scale the stats that it's actually going to be pretty difficult to reach your resistance caps to where it's actually reasonable, right? So you're actually going to have to make some concessions on your gear to actually go for resistances, which I don't necessarily disagree with them. As much as I love Crystallized Omniscience, I did feel it was kind of too powerful in the sense, like, if you're running any sort of elemental build, it is just so obscenely powerful that you really have to run it in some way, especially with elemental attack builds. And you still will be running it with a lot of elemental attack builds, but they took it down to a level where you might have other options where you don't have to just go so all in into Omniscience and getting stats on your gear. So I don't necessarily disagree with them here. I think it's fairly reasonable. It definitely hurts, but for an amulet with so much power built into it, they were really forcing you to go all in and balance all your gear. You now can't just slap some gear together that has a bunch of stats on it and just get a bunch of pin and your resistances are easy to take care of. Now I think it's a much more high-end amulet, and it's going to take significantly more gear min-maxing to extract the amount of power that you'd want to be able to extract out of it to actually make it usable. So overall, I think this was a decent change in terms of trying to shake it up and making people feel like they at least have some other options in the meantime, and it's there when you actually really want to min-max your gear. So I don't fault them here. I think this is pretty reasonable. Okay, next up we got Melding of the Flesh getting a pretty decent nerf here. I think this is something that a lot of the community was expecting. This is not a surprising nerf whatsoever. Essentially, now it's going to have an additional downside of a reduction to your maximum all resistances, 4 to 6%. So overall, understandable change. Melding was extremely powerful in its current state, and they wanted to take it down a notch, and seems pretty reasonable to me. All right, next up we can talk about Brittle getting a pretty significant nerf. This one's also pretty understandable. I think Brittle was extremely powerful and very highly abused in the state that it's currently in 3.18, and they decided to take it down a little bit, but I still think it's extremely good. I still think Brittle is going to be in a great state. A lot of people are still going to use it, and yeah, I still think it's going to be a very significant amount of power that you can achieve on your character for very little investment. Basically just get an interrogation jewel and scale your ailment effectiveness a little bit. That's really all that it boils down to, right? Now it grants up to 6% instead of 15% base crit, which 15% was insane. We're talking base crit, which is extremely powerful. And even at 6%, that's still absolutely amazing. They did reduce its default value of 2%, which was previously 5%. But again, with some ailment scaling, you can get this right back up. You'll still get 6% base crit. That is still pretty awesome, and it will still be used a lot and still be good for a lot of builds. So overall, pretty reasonable change. Brittle is still very good. All right, so let's talk about these reservation changes. Disappointing to say the least. I don't think this was necessary whatsoever. They're literally removing the mastery that granted 15% increased mana reservation efficiency, which is a massive hit, right? These other two, the reductions in life reservation efficiency from 30 to 20 and the aura effect from 15 down to 10, they're at least somewhat reasonable nerfs. They're not gonna, I don't think they're really gonna kill any builds, but what is gonna cause a lot of issues, especially for higher end builds, is this removal of the mastery that it gave you 50% mana reservation efficiency. I think this is a little too harsh. I think this could have been toned down to 10, maybe even 8%, and it still would have been powerful enough to warrant grabbing as a mastery. But just removing it altogether, I think, is just detrimental to the game. In its current state, most high-end builds, when you want to do higher-end content, it's so demanding on not only defensive auras, but also offensive auras to scale your damage high enough to actually do it, that this is going to hinder a lot of builds significantly. What I think this means is essentially any high-end build where you have any sort of issues with mana reservation efficiency, which is most builds because you're trying to fit in as much as you can, you're basically going to be forced to travel to either Sovereignty or Charisma and anoint the other one. That's really what I think this is going to boil down to. If you don't do both of those things, you essentially are going to you're going to have an entire aura removed from either your offensive or defensive layers, which is extremely impactful. And I think this is what they were going for, which is a little disappointing because even in the current state with defensive aura stacking, you could still get deleted, right? Even in the current state with offensive, like you could scale a ton of damage, but you kind of needed that amount of damage to do the higher end content like Uber bosses and Feared and really high end Delirium. Those things were pretty much necessary to do those things, and now they're targeting them to try and make it harder and harder to do those things. It's just something I just do not agree with whatsoever. This is going to cut down on build diversity quite a bit, in my opinion. It's going to make mana reservation a lot more of an issue than it already was before, and just cause even more headaches when it comes to gearing. So don't agree with this one whatsoever. I hope maybe they backpedal on this one along with some other changes, but I highly doubt it. This is another disappointing change. Okay, working our way towards the end here, we're going to touch on these Flask Nerfs. Another one that I staunchly disagree with. I think Flasks in their current state are terribly designed, and most of the player base would definitely agree that Flasks are extremely annoying to upkeep in their current state, at least before the Instilling Orbs and these prefixes right here that they're taking away. Yeah, I don't see the point of this, really. I don't think anybody will agree with this change whatsoever. I think pretty much the entire player base loved these changes with these Flask prefixes and with the Instilling Orbs and things of that nature. It basically enabled you to mostly automate your Flask, whether it be bossing or mapping scenario, not really have to worry about them. Flasks were super reliable and something that most people were definitely in favor of, and now it's basically getting walked back, right? They're taking this away from us once again, and it makes absolutely no sense as to why they're doing it. I don't understand this change. Nobody was asking for this. This was not a change that was warranted. I think it's just a slap in the face to the players, really. Like, what is the point of this change? This accomplishes nothing other than making Flasks once again extremely frustrating to deal with, and it's just another disappointing change and another disconnect between GGG and the players, in my opinion. So I guess this is what we're just going to have to deal with, at least in a mapping scenario. I feel like it won't be too big of a deal, but in any sort of bossing scenario, this is going to be a significant issue once again. So disappointing to say the least. Okay, last but not least, we got the Chainbreaker rework. This is essentially just a massive nerf that nobody asked for, that was uncalled for, unwarranted. Chainbreaker was already kind of niche enough, and now they just made sure nobody's ever going to use it ever again. I think people were doing the math on it with something like 400 mana regen to make it usable, which is obscene for any build, much less an attack build. To expect an attack build to invest any sort of massive amount of mana regen to extract damage from a mechanic is ridiculous. And I think this is a good capstone on kind of what I think about the 3.19 balance manifesto, and how I've lost even more confidence in GGG to make some more reasonable changes to, especially to the obscure mechanics that maybe nobody's really keeping their eye on or expecting changes on. It seems like they just kind of pick out of a hat just a massive change, like, oh yeah, let's just go with this and just implement it. Like, it really seems to me like a lot of the people making these balance changes truly do not understand the mechanics in their own game to the extent that would allow them to actually make reasonable balance changes, because this is just insane. Nobody asks for something like this. I don't even use Chainbreaker that much, but I'm still appalled by it. Like, this is just ridiculous, right? And I've lost a lot of confidence, even more confidence in GGG to make actual reasonable balance changes, and I truly am worried about the future of this game. It's like, I love PoE, but I am not in the GGG camp at all at this point. This is very disappointing, and it really makes me worry about the future of this game. I think they're stretched a bit thin with the development of PoE 2, while also having to develop leagues every 3 months and balance PoE 1. And I think it's really, really showing its ass here, and it's very disappointing. And I really am worried about the future of this game, and if it even survives to PoE 2 to where it's large enough to even make that big of a difference. Quite honestly, I think if we keep going at this pace, PoE is mostly just going to be a dead game by the time PoE 2 comes out, and it won't generate enough of a hype to really even matter, right? Like, PoE 2's been hyped for so long, but then this PoE 1 just keeps dying and dying and dying, and more power reduction to try and prepare people for PoE 2. But at the same time, we have to worry about the player base. We have to worry about keeping the player base healthy, and it's just not happening at this point. I think this is going to be a disappointing league. I really hope the league mechanic is amazing. I hope there's some sort of really cool skill gems that people can try out. There is still hope, right? There is still the patch notes. But this is just disappointing overall. I'm very disappointed. I think some of the changes were warranted and reasonable, but I think most of them really missed the mark, and it does make me kind of sad. Yeah, I think that's going to do it for me. Thanks for watching till the end. If you haven't already, like and subscribe for more content in the future. And if you like the video, I'll be posting as much as I can, especially with the league coming up. I'll try and generate as much content as I can for you guys, some good content to help out, especially the newer players. So yeah, stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.